Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
The speaker now, this is Professor Joseph Jordan, lives right in Huntington, and he's a professor at Holy Apostles College and Seminary in Connecticut, and he teaches online. And he also takes classes online. He just finished a master's in theology with them. He has I can't even count all his degrees. He's almost done with his PhD in political theory at Catholic U. He teaches politics and economics, okay. But he also has degrees in undergraduate and master's degrees in history, philosophy, political science, a minor in theology. I went to St. John's, so he's associated with several Catholic universities. His research interests include the history and development of political ideas, the psychology of ideology, and the role of on him before. Another thing Professor Jordan has done is come here in the summer for the Aquinas Leadership Institute with Redpath. That's a really nice scholarly institute, and he's presented there also. He lives in Huntington. He has a wife and 2 children. So please welcome Joseph Jordan.
Thank you, Elise, for that introduction, and thank you, everyone, for coming here today. On top of all that, to pay the bills, I actually work full-time for New York City government, so it's, I don't need much sleep, I guess, but a lot of coffee. Once again, thank you all for coming here. I want to thank Elise for inviting me to this talk. I want to thank Peter Redpath and Sebastian Mahfood for helping to publicize this as well. And Merry Christmas, everyone. Merry Christmas. And Happy New Year. You know, we see those signs, keep Christ in Christmas. And I think Mahfood for helping to publicize this as well. And Merry Christmas, everyone. Merry Christmas. And Happy New Year. You know, we see those signs, keep Christ in Christmas. And I think we should also keep Christmas in Christmas, because we could say this is the culmination of the Christmas season today, January 6th, the Feast of the Epiphany, right? When we talk about Lewis and Christmas, there's a separate set of books, and what I plan on talking about today, the Narnia Chronicles, children's fiction, right? But with a lot of adult themes there, very, very good, rich, mature theology and philosophy and just fun literature in those books. There's a cameo of someone we associate with Christmas time. It tends to be a secular person, or saint, I guess these days. When the kids from Earth go off to Narnia, right? Father Christmas, and we know him as Santa Claus. And it's such a fleeting cameo he makes. The first time I read it years ago, I said, was that necessary? Why was that included in this story here? But I think it is necessary to give us a glimpse into what Lewis is trying to do throughout all of his works, especially his fiction works, what he's trying to call us to pay attention to, because he will say in his books, especially in the books we'll talk about, one of the things that Lewis, I think, is trying to call our attention to is, and we'll talk about this in the books we look at today, is that mythology, the myths that we have in this world, are realities in other worlds. And so when that jolly man comes and makes his cameo in the Narnia books, yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus, right? So it's very brief and fleeting, and yet there's more truth in that than a lot of what you'll see around the world this day. Merry Christmas on this Feast of the Epiphany. And we see another cameo in the biblical stories on this day, right? There's some debate in historical theology about these 3 wise men. I'm from Brooklyn, so I'm not going to call them 3 wise guys, but originally from Brooklyn, I should say. But the Magi from the East. And what East was it? Was it Persia? Was it just Petra in Jordan? Are those kings coming from Africa, Europe, and Asia to be more diverse? right? The story of the Magi coming to meet baby Jesus is a very rich story for us as well. So whether it's, I don't want to say mythologized in any, the story of the Magi coming to meet baby Jesus is a very rich story for us as well. So whether it's, I don't want to say mythologized in any way, because there's good reason to say it was true. Certainly the story has developed over the years. But I think it's kismet. I think it's serendipity. I think it's appropriate that this talk today should fall on the Feast of the Epiphany when we commemorate those Magi, because what were they following? A star. Some type of astronomical phenomena was taking place, and that led them to the way and the truth and the life. A little baby boy, right, in Bethlehem. Something took place up in the stars, in the heavens, in deep heaven, which led them from around the world, the wise men. And what were their names, if we go with the account that have? Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. It's Caspar the Friendly Ghost, that's not him. There's a very prolific German theologian, Hans Urs von Balthasar, that's not him. But there's Melchior. Now, I want to mention his name right now because the preface to that name, Mel, right, is a king. In certain languages, Semitic languages especially, we hear of Melchizedek, right? A king, a person who apparently never died in this world. Mel, keep that in mind, because we'll put that on the shelf and return to it a bit later on, as Lewis will adopt and adapt that preface, that prefix of Mel. So we're led here today to talk about C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy on the Feast of the Epiphany, where wise people came to find out something about truth. So what is it that Lewis might be pointing us to regarding it? Now, what is it about this story? He wrote 3 books in the Space Trilogy, and Lewis reminds us several times that they can each be read on their own individually. Okay, I do recommend if you start with the first one, Out of the Silent Planet, you go straight through to the end. It makes some time. You don't have to do it all in one sitting. But they do hold together nicely. The second book in that series is called Perelandra, and the third is called That Hideous Strength. And I'll explain what those titles mean in a bit. The first book, Out of the Silent Planet, was published in 1938. The second one, Perelandra, came out around 1942-43, and the last one, That Hideous Strength, came out in 1945. Was written before World War II began in Europe. Right? Published in 1938, World War II will begin in Europe, September 1st, 1939. In the second book, that was written in the middle of the war, when things didn't look that great in Western Europe, certainly not for England, where Lewis was writing, but the inclusion of the United States into the war effort helped. Good speeches by Winston Churchill helped. By 1945, when it looked like the tide had turned and things were improving, Lewis brings the trilogy to a conclusion. I highlight this fact about World War II because there is a combat theme. There are conflictual themes. There's tensions on an interplanetary scale, perhaps even intergalactic scale, that he'll explore in a combat theme. There are conflictual themes. There's tensions on an interplanetary scale, perhaps even intergalactic scale, that he'll explore in the Space Trilogy. But Lewis was very local. And he'll make references throughout the books to the young boys in the trenches who are fighting. As his hero, Elwyn Ransom, is combating forces of darkness and peculiar sentient beings in Mars, Venus, as he travels throughout the solar system. He keeps reminding himself, they got 19-year-old boys leading troops, facing far worse challenges than his own characters may have been facing. So that's a clear and present image in his mind. And he knew something about war, Lewis did, because he fought in World War I. He wasn't there long, but he was entrusted with about 30 soldiers under his leadership. Got wounded, got sick, and spent much of the rest of the war recovering from it. But he and his friends, his colleagues, and many young men of his generation knew what war tasted like firsthand. Tolkien, his friend, J.R.R. Tolkien, was also in World War I. And a lot of what they encountered on the battlefield, as far as the martial virtues, honor, justice, truth, risk, courage, self-sacrifice, real self-sacrifice, not a false imposed martyrdom, but truly laying down one's life, or being willing to lay down one's life for their friends, is clear in Lewis's works. It's clear in Tolkien's works as well. Now, when it comes to this first book, Out of the Silent Planet, when it comes to the whole trilogy, and when it comes to Tolkien's works as well, it started almost as a bet between Tolkien and Lewis. They were friends. They taught together. They went out and they would have some pints of ale, as they tend to drink in England, together. They would meet regularly. They had their own group of writers called the Inklings. And in England at that time, small clubs, social groups, were very common. All sorts of organizations popped up. Keep that in mind when you think of a song by the Kinks, right? The Village song came many decades later, where they list, this rock and roll band lists so many different groups. An organization to save lemon meringue pie. This is the type of society that Lewis found himself in. And a lot of British culture and English culture celebrated that once upon a time. You look around this room, clearly we're all brought here for a common interest. And that's a good thing. That's a healthy thing, as Lewis would have understood. He and Tolkien would meet with their friends, have some pints of ale, and share their drafts. They would drink some drafts, they would share their draft writings, and they would test ideas on each other. And they were pretty rough. These were Oxford dons, but they were pretty sarcastic in their criticism of each other, as they needed to be, because they cared about each other. And these were men like on the front lines of the Great War, World War I. So a ribbing here and there verbally they could handle. They lamented the fact that the state of literature, especially this newly developing genre of science fiction, was somewhat dismal in their eyes. Science fiction could entail traveling throughout the solar system, into outer space, colonizing the moon. H.G. Wells had written about this. Science fiction could also entail traveling through time, so not just space but also time. H.G. Wells had written about that. Lewis respected and admired what Wells had done. He was also somewhat critical of some of the more secular conclusions that Wells had incorporated. So they basically made a bet between what Wells had done. He was also somewhat critical of some of the more secular conclusions that Wells had incorporated. So they basically made a bet between themselves, okay, can we improve the state of this new genre? And pretty much out of a coin toss, they determined that Lewis was going to write about traveling throughout the stars, and Tolkien would write about traveling back in time somehow. So you get some rudiments of the reasons for the Lord of the Rings from Tolkien and the Space Trilogy from Lewis. Okay, so that's the origins of these books. Now, there were some other influences that caused this. Lewis had enjoyed very much Wells's books. Also, there were books such as David Lindsay's A Voyage to Arcturus, which fascinated him about traveling into other planets and what that could mean for the soul and spirits, where science itself becomes a type of religion. And Examples of this crowd would include Olaf Stapleton in his Last and First Men, which expands billions of years of humid or humanoid evolution. You also get J.B.S. Haldane. And this man, Haldane, was a very popularizer of science. And some of the new breakthroughs in science, what that might mean for ourselves and also ourselves as a species, and where we might be going, and what the meaning of it all could possibly be. Haldane's possible worlds concern Lewis. Now, he has the literary interests of trying to clean up or develop or enhance this idea of science fiction. He has the pressing concern of fiction. He has the pressing concern of scientistic imperialism, idolatry in his eyes, ideology, of explaining everything through a quantifiable, numbers-based, hard sciences type of approach. And all of this is stewing in his mind as he sits down to write these books. And the first book will be Out of the Silent Planet. This is the silent planet, Earth. And the book starts off with a character, the main protagonist through most of these books, Elwyn Ransom. Fictional. Some people have said that Tolkien inspired the character. Ransom is a college professor. A number of the characters in these books are college professors. Lewis says that he wrote the stories using that group of people from that class and professional background. He wrote the stories using that group of people from that class and professional background because it's the professional class he knew the best. If he had been a plumber, perhaps he would have written about plumbers. But I think he's being modest to an extent because the ideas that go on in universities will eventually spill out, as I kind of hinted at earlier. Ideas have consequences, and Lewis is very well aware of that. This is all prior to World War II, remember, as this is being developed. Lewis was aware of what was going on in the continent, new ideas, even not so new ideas, of eugenics, some of which were developed right down the road in a certain laboratory, if you know your geography around here, and were very popular across the Atlantic in Germany, especially North Germany. Lewis was concerned about that, as well as the imaginative literary works being Stapleton and Haldane. The consequences could be devastating. Out of the Silent Planet, Elwyn Ransom, this fictional character, gets kidnapped by a mad scientist and a businessman. I guess a mad businessman. I don't want to suggest that businessmen are mad. And they take him to a new world. Lewis, as he relates that journey to this new planet, he doesn't know where he's going, Elwyn Ransom. He's looking out the window. This is 1938, and he is trying to relay to his audience what the forces of gravity might mean as the spaceship leaves the Earth. How light would interact with the spaceship through the windows. What the moon might look like. And what Lewis does is very skillfully, he develops a suspense in that journey. Much of that book, much of Perelandra as well, the second book in the series, is about movement forward, marching forward, running forward, flying forward, journeying. Those two books show a hero's quest in the long-standing tradition of hero's quests, going back to all of our most ancient myths, to use that word again. When they land on this new world, Lewis begins to figure out that he is meant to be, by the scientist and businessman, a human sacrifice to some sort of alien life form called the Sorns. And Lewis relays very skillfully the psychology, the fear of the of the imagined but unmet extraterrestrial beings, the Sorns. The of the imagined but unmet extraterrestrial beings, the Sorns. What are they? When he finally encounters one, he runs away. And much of the rest of the book is how he is trying to survive. But I don't want to give away too much of the story. I'm going to say spoiler alerts here and there. I don't want to have to say that. I want you to read the books. Many of you probably have read the book. If you haven't, please go out and do so. And if you have read it, please go back and read it. And when we get to our conclusion today, I'll explain why. So, Lewis encounters these alien beings, and what we find out, the planet he landed on is Mars. But he also finds out that Mars has a different name in, quote, reality, shall we say, reality beyond this world. Because the language that we have, such as the extraterrestrial life that he encounters on Mars and Venus, and the angelic life that he'll encounter, tap into the original language, the true ancient language of this field of Arbol. The field of Arbol is the solar system. The sun, the name of the sun is Arbol. The name of Mercury is, and please bear with me as I try to pronounce these, because it is always tricky with some of these words. Viritrilbia. Venus is Paralandra, the title of the second book. Mars is Malacandra. The moon itself is really called Sova. Earth is the silent planet, for reasons I'll explain, but that gets translated into the original language of our solar system as Thulkandra. Jupiter is Glundandra, language of our solar system as Thulkandra. Jupiter is Glundandra. Saturn is Lurga. Uranus is Nurava. And at that point, 1938, that was pretty much the extent that scientists were aware of planetary bodies beyond. Growing up, we had 9, for me. Now with my son, he asked me, Daddy, how many planets are there? I had to say 8. But I'm a bit of a rebel. So it's still 9. Pluto, right? We don't really get a name for those. But what we are introduced is a new language. And we are introduced to the idea that something happened once upon a time, prior to even the creation of the earth. As the story unfolds, we encounter 3 different species, if you will, of sentient life forms, 3 different types of aliens. The first one, who he is supposed to be a human sacrifice for, the Sorns, who scare him. The second one, the Harosa, which are kind of like big chipmunks, or beavers, if you will. And the third one, which is very, very difficult to pronounce, the Pfifltrigg, that's Pfifltrigg, who are kind of like mechanics, industrious, somewhat businessmen, good businessmen, constantly working deep in the bowels of Mars, building things. Turned out to be not so bad after all. And I'm not revealing too much of the story by saying that. It's something we need to be aware of. And there might even be some scriptural suggestions of this, imaginatively, if there are life forms on other planets. Because they're not so bad because there was never an original sin on Mars, the way there was here on Earth with our species. Now, we look around, we're the only sentient life forms that we know of. Some scientists today have suggested perhaps dolphins could be, on our level. They don't compose concertos, they don't build great cities. I'm not quite sure if that's a fair statement, but I appreciate the nod to dolphin intelligence. But on Mars, you have 3 different types of sentient life forms, incarnate physical life forms, species. And they each had their own style about them, they each had their own sort of nature about them or purpose. The Sorns are very intellectual. They live high up in the mountains, almost on their own. They do have some type of community amongst themselves. They're very scientific in a good way. And their language is very plain. They get right to the point. The Piffletrigs, like I said earlier, they're engineers. They like to build things. They also get to the point, but they're very ornate. They like to decorate they incorporate meaning into their creations and productions. And that other group, the Chrosa, are that chipmunk-like or beaver-like group, which play a very key role in the story because Lewis early on befriends one of them, Hoy, who teaches him that ancient language and teaches him what it means to be good as a sentient creature. They are the poets. They are the poets. And it is revealed during the story that they don't understand, one, where this guy Ransom is from, and what's actually going on Earth, because Earth is a silent planet. No communications have been shared from that sector of the field of Arbol, as we know the solar system. For some reason, ties have been cut off, and becomes that sector of the field of Arbol, as we know the solar system. For some reason, ties have been cut off, and becomes apparent that all the other planets are in communication with each other somehow. So what happened? And they say to Ransom, it must be unfortunate for you that there's only one sentient life form on your planet, because you don't have the opportunity to share with other types of sentient life forms. Now, we would like to think, and certainly in the 1930s when Lewis is writing these stories, that the human race, we're the pinnacle of the entire universe. Sure, we're made in the image and likeness of God. But as the stories unfold, we find out that with that great responsibility and privilege, has become a great burden for us, that we don't know how to interact with the other planets, life forms, intelligent life forms, willful life forms, whether physical or immaterial, whether animal or spiritual. And so that mad scientist, Weston is his name, he wants to conquer Mars. That's why he kidnapped Ransom and brought him to Mars as a sacrifice, because he thought that by exchanging this human being to the Sorns, those scientists, those intellectual aliens on Mars, they would exchange knowledge about how to further explore the universe. And then Weston can conquer the universe. But Ransom finds out that that's not what the Sorns want. They wanted to communicate with him and learn from him and teach him and find out why something happened on Earth once upon a time, and what life is like on Earth once upon a time, because they're getting ready for war. Perhaps just like England was in 1938. So you have this interaction with these alien species, which is comical at times. And we see Ransom grow. His soul grows, his intellect grows, and his will grows. He becomes a unified being, and he's able to do some amazing things on Mars. What we also find is that Lewis has woven in a number of Christian themes, explicitly Christian themes, but using that ancient solar language. Right? God is considered the old one, or Mal Eldil, the young one, or simply the third one. And we could use our imagination there, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. Now, remember I mentioned earlier, we're going to put Melchior on the shelf. We have Mel Ildil. Malelidl. The Eldils are spirits. The Eldils are angels. The chief angel, the chief spirit, the chief being is called Mel Ildil. And for a lot of English readers, we may encounter that and think, well, that's going to be bad, because we think of mal, from the Latin roots, I guess, right? Maelstrom, malevolent. But no, that's not what Lewis is suggesting here at all. To call God Mel Eldil actually harkens back to that ancient, more Semitic, Eastern idea of the Mal Kilzedek, the Mel Koyer. This is the king of the angels. This is the king of all being This is the king of all being that we're referencing. So if you read the books and you encounter it, don't be thrown off too much there. Or if you've ever wondered why that might be a reason that Lewis used that word, that's one hypothesis, and I think it makes sense, especially on this Feast of the Epiphany. Now, as the story unfolds, we find out that there was a major ancient cosmic / spiritual battle that took place in the heavens long before many of the worlds were created, the worlds that we know, the planets. And the collateral damage of that are things such as the fact that Mars has these canal lines all throughout them. We look at Mars today, it's just a big red thing. We have the Mars rovers that are taking wonderful pictures of it for about a decade now. So we have a better sources of his depiction of Mars is an early telescopic image that was popularized going back to the late 1800s of there being these lines all cracked throughout Mars. What we find out is that on Mars, these different species live at different points, different heights of the planet. On the top surface, the reddish part of Mars that we know so well, kind of barren. It's kind of empty. He'll see forests, but they're petrified. They're frozen. Something happened up there. There's no real life on that top surface of Mars. But as he descends deep into Mars, he begins to encounter atmosphere and air that he can breathe, more vibrant colors. That's where the Hrossa live. That's where their civilization is. That's where the poetry is found. And as you go even deeper and deeper into, if you're on a ship and you go down to the engine room, you find those mechanics keeping the ship afloat. If you're on a ship and you go down to the engine room, you find those mechanics keeping the ship afloat. He'll get that other, very difficult to pronounce, alien race making things. And they do exchange with each other. Why are there these cracks on Mars? Lewis doesn't really go into it. I think one of the things that fed his imagination was his experience on the trenches in World War I. And the no man's land up on top, which was completely barren and desolate. The action, the human action, or the humanoid action, if you will take place in those trenches, in what Lewis calls in the book the Handramit, which is the old language, the old solar language of the land deep in those cracks and crevices in those valleys. When Elwyn Ransom, the character, has to climb up to get to the top of the planet, when Elwyn Ransom, the character, has to climb up to get to the top of the planet, it's very difficult to breathe, much as someone facing a gas attack in World War I would have experienced, and certainly where the air is not as dense and you can't really breathe it in. The collateral damage of this ancient battle, cosmic spiritual battle, is that Mars was on the front lines in that angelic war that we may have some mythos about, some mythological traces of. The devil cast out of heaven like a bolt of lightning. Scripture tells us, right? A barak, as it would have been called then. Well, Earth, where the fall will take place for us, happens because the devil causes a lot of mayhem here. And the devil wanted to conquer the other planets as well. But the great spirit of Mars stood up to that devil, stood up to that bad angel and bad spirit. But the battle took place on the surface of Mars. That was the front lines. That was the no man's land. And that's why Mars ends up looking the way it did. And keep that in mind as we'll talk about Venus later on and some of the other planets later on. What Lewis is weaving into the story are Christian themes of angelic combat, with ancient classical themes, somewhat pagan themes, that planets themselves were types of gods or spirits, along with his own day-to-day experiences on the front lines of World War I, with his own concerns of civil war, that the human race can perfect itself using science and should go out amongst the stars. Some of the stories that he had been reading, some of the science fiction stories that he and Tolkien were reading, suggested that the human race could perfect itself, and then after we used up this planet, just go to the next one, and then the next one, and treat those planets the way we've treated everything here, that we've just gobbled up and tossed away. Now, some of the influences for the other characters in the book, such as this guy Weston, may have come from people like George Bernard Shaw, who he wrote a book about the beginning of the human race, right, back to Methuselah, and presidential candidate, or could have been presidential candidate, Robert F. Kennedy was very quick to talk about the beginning of the human race, right, back to Methuselah, and presidential candidate, or could have been presidential candidate, Robert F. Kennedy was very quick to quote him, quote Shaw, in that play, where he says that some people see things as they are and ask why. I treat things that never were and say, why not? Does that sound nice? Yeah. Human potential. It's kind of scary when you think about a politician quoting a character who's a devil, and that's has nothing to do with partisanship or anything like that. I'm just saying that when you think about where the roots of that idea come from, because we hear Weston, that mad scientist, constantly ask that question in Out of the Silent Planet. Why not? Why can't we do this? And why not? We're entrepreneurial, right? We like to build things. We like to test things out, as science says we should. Well, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And Weston has lost that lesson. For Weston, the mad scientist, there is no should. There is no ought. For him, it's just facts, 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 like Gradgrind in Dickens' story. Just give us what is the data. Meaning has no meaning for Weston, the mad scientist. For him, it's just, well, there is no just. Because if you have no meaning, you have no aim. If you have no aim, you have no nature, no purpose. And the mad scientist can't explain why he's doing what he's doing. When the spirit of Mars, the Oi Arsa of Malacandra language, right? Who's the ruler of Mars, speaks to Weston to figure out, why are you doing these things? Why have you murdered some of the inhabitants of my planet who I am supposed to take care of and who have never meant ill will toward you? We find out Weston saying, well, we have to advance humanity. Humanity, an abstract idea. Well, what's so special about humanity, this abstract idea that we must advance? Well, because we're the best. We're the winners. Here you get those influences of that Darwinian type of evolutionary or survival of the fittest. Just because we're here, it worked, and we got to keep pushing that forward. There's this cosmic imperialism, even a spiritual imperialism. Humanity. Not about this fellow man. He was willing to sacrifice. And this spirit of Mars, the Oisara, says, you were going to kill him. You're willing to let him die. Why would you? What's so special about this humanity then? Collateral damage. His sacrifice is so we can all advance. We all. Well, what's so special about humanity? Our intellect. Well, these other sentient life forms on Mars, who it becomes clear are going to be sacrificed for this great march of scientism, this imperialistic drive of the mad scientist. What about them? They have the intellect that you have, that you worship so much. Why not save them and work with them, talk with them? There's scenes where Weston, when he begins to try to speak with these other beings on Mars, it's baby talk. It's condescending. They don't know what condescension is. They don't know what any type of vice is on Mars. They're all virtuous and good because they had no fall. They were protected in those trenches. But you can see how Weston, and that imperialistic, that hubris, that mindset, that viciousness is just so disrespectful to the Martians. Why not work with them? Weston doesn't want it. In fact, we find out through that almost like a Socratic dialogue, a dialogue between the spirit of Mars. And Ransom is just there, watching this. He's actually translating some of the conversation between Weston and that Martian spirit. We find some of that Shavian, which is how you say Shaw, George Bernard Shaw, idea, why not? Pure potency. We can do it, Bernard Shaw, idea, why not? Pure potency. We can do it, let's try it. You see some of the imperialism of a Cecil Rhodes, who had no problem sacrificing Africa for his ambitions. We see some of the other scientific ideas of a Haldane. Everything is just what's quantifiable and testable, and that's it. Play out. With potency. With potency. Keep that in mind. There are those of you who may have had a chance to ever study Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas are aware of pure act. Right? God is pure being. In fact, the last speaker that was here, Robert Delfino, is a friend of mine. He talked about this, and if you were at that talk a few weeks ago, about reasons to become more fully human, more fully ourselves. What does that really play out as? What does that really look as? Well, God would be pure existence. God is. Scripture tells us, I am that I am. That's the name of God. You can't put a name on it. The opposite of pure act would be pure potency. And that's what Weston confesses. What reveals he wants is for us to reduce ourselves to pure potency. He rejects act as pure act in being. And instead he wants us to be able to be pure potency, because if we are pure potency, he doesn't say it in these words, but if we are pure potency, perhaps we ourselves could become gods. And to go back to that Shavian quote, George Bernard Shaw, some look at things that are not. Some look at things that are not and wonder why not. Why are we not gods? That's what Weston is trying to do, and that's what the mad scientism is trying to do. It creates an idol of the intellect. It creates an idol of science, an idol of human ambitions, of what we, quote, could do, and what should be done, regardless of the fact that we've been told time and time again, don't do that, have no graven images, etc., is out of the question. Now, this is a very brief overview of that book, and I've left out so much. Some of the things that I want to point out that I have to leave out, but I want you to look for them, is the way that Lewis explores physical phenomena, like light, color, even you to look for them, is the way that Lewis explores physical phenomena, like light, color, even sound. I don't have time to go into that. And it's always difficult to translate one medium into another. But and he does say this in one of the books, where he says that our ability to see is limited, of course, by the colors in the spectrum we can see, but obviously there's so much more to the spectrum. The ultraviolet rays that insects could see, right? Radio waves. Imagine if you could see radio waves. He plays with language in such a beautiful way some of the best, I think, in the English language we have to explore what sound could taste like and what smell could sound like, if you get where I'm going with this. So I want to today, but if you're not, go and look at how he paints a picture of what life on other planets could look like, because he gives us an idea of how life on our own planet might look like to us. That's book one. The second book, Paralandra, that's the old solar system name, the original name for Venus. And what we find here is, and Lewis admits this in one of his letters, he in the first book, he's taking a stab at science fiction. He's trying to imagine what it's like being in a rocket ship, hurtling through space, going past the moon, dealing with the chance of losing oxygen. When he goes to Venus, he's just basically swept away by the angels, right? The angels. And he lands on Venus. Now, who are these angels? Away by the angels, right? The angels. And he lands on Venus. Now, who are these angels again? I mentioned this Oi Arsa of Malacandra, this ruling spirit of Malacandra, of Mars. Oi Arsa. The word itself is interesting, that Lewis says that there was a medieval scholar called Bernardus Silvestris. This man existed. He wrote books about outer space, about the planets, and how they interact with worldly events as part of that ancient cosmology that we've lost in the modern era. E-R-R-O-R? No. That we've lost in the modern era, E-R-A. And Silvestris apparently uses this word once to describe basically the nature, the ruling nature of the planets. Oi Arsa. Is how the Arsa is the archon, the arch, the ruler in the Greek. And the Oi, O-Y, euphoria, good in the Greek. The good ruler. The good ruler. So for Lewis, in his imagination, each planet has its own good ruler, its own spirit, its overlord, that is the nature of that planet, that sets things in motion on that planet, that looks after the inhabitants of that planet. And all the planets have their own Oi Arsa. They are the king spirits, if you will, that Eldils I mentioned earlier, the king spirits of each planet. They themselves are the Eldils. Each one has its own planet. It would be like if you could be a god of your own world. And there may be some scriptural reference for that as well. Not in the God as the creator God that we may worship, but as in some type of powerful ordering principle that can help. The Oi Arsa swift Elwyn Ransom to Paralandra, Venus, in the second book. And he lands not in a rocky world like Mars, but in a watery world, which is what Venus was imagined to be. Now, Venus, as we know from some of the one or two satellites that ever landed on Venus, it didn't last long because it's so hot and the pressure of the clouds in nonfiction, a real NASA exploration. It is rocky, but Venus back then was considered to be a watery planet. And sure enough, Lewis incorporates that into his story, because we have these giant waves that go up as high as Mount Everest and come crashing down. And in the first few pages, you might get seasick reading it. There's this constant up and down and up, and it's floating around. It's not fixed. And he ends up meeting a woman, the Green Lady, as she's called, who's very innocent, very pure. And he could immediately see in her face the virtue and goodness. And the questions that she asks him are so pure and good and innocent. And he's asking her, well, are there other people here? I'd like to meet them. She's hominoid, whereas the other characters on Mars did not look like human beings really at all. She looks like a human being. Almost, you perhaps could imagine, like a transfigured human being. She has not been corrupted in any way She said she's looking for her king. Now, the king is out there, and the king's going to show up one day, and she's waiting for him passionately. And he can't understand how she could be waiting so long for this king to show up. But she said she's looking for her king. Now, the king is out there, and the king's going to show up one day, and she's waiting for him passionately. And he can't understand how she could be waiting so long for this king to show up. But he starts looking for the king too. Because he can't figure out why he was sent to Paralandra. He was just told to go. Now, Abraham, just go out for a walk. Don't worry. Figure out why later on. I'm sorry. Ransom, go out to Paralandra. You'll figure out why later on. And so you get that hero's quest. He goes to the strange world yet again, another strange world, a watery world, a very fluid world, which is in contrast to the rocky, rigid world of Mars, isn't it? And here you see Lewis playing upon literary themes. You see him playing upon archetypical themes. You see him playing upon cosmological themes. Mars is what? Martial. Right? Looney Tunes did this. A Marvelman brush on his head, he's a little soldier. Mars is always depicted as a soldier ready to go off to war. And there's clearly, as I said, the geography of the terrain, the trenches. There's a war going on. War had gone on, we learned. The spiritual cosmic war on Mars. Whereas Venus, none of that took place. And whereas Venus in mythology is a goddess, who does he encounter? The Green Lady, like a goddess. Where on Venus it's very fluid and watery. It's not rigid. There's no war. In fact, she doesn't even know what peace is. She asks, what is peace? Because she has nothing to contrast that with or to. It's a different place. And what we find out is that they see a strike of light go across the sky, lightning, descend from the heavens. Yet again, a devil cast out from the heavens, lands on Venus. And the mad scientist, he's shown up at Venus. And Weston surprises Lewis. Well, Weston's first response to Lewis is, what are you doing here? Explain yourself. I'm here for a reason, but how did you get here? But Weston surprises Ransom by speaking the perfect old language. Or I should say, speaking it perfectly. I can't even speak it perfectly. Right? I can't even speak my own perfectly. Like I said, I'm from Brooklyn originally. So, what unfolds in that story is you witnessing what it could have been like in the Garden of Eden when the devil was tempting Eve, when she was out by herself. And the story that unfolds isn't just like, hey, you want an apple? Don't believe that other guy. Lewis does an amazing job, I think, in exploring the psychology of the temptation. And the psychology not just of what was going through Eve's mind, or this green lady's mind, through the types of questions that only an Eve or this green lady would ask, given what that innocence and purity entailed. But you also see the psychology of what's going through your mind, especially given what we know about science, especially given what we think we know about being a human being. After all, don't we want to grow up? Is knowledge really that bad after all? I mean, we're not like cattle out in the field, right? There's something to us that's dignified, and part of that dignity is a will, and part of that dignity is an intellect. And we see played out in those pages the tempting of the will and the tempting of the intellect. Played out in those pages the tempting of the will and the tempting of the intellect. And what makes it so diabolical is how skilled this presentation is. At one point, Ransom says, I wish I had the devil from Milton's Paradise Lost, a Mephistopheles from Faustus, but I'm really met with the actual thing here. And in reading that, I think to myself, well, we don't get to pick our own devil, do we? Right? We might make our own devils here and there through the idols. But the devil that is presented to the reader, and is presented to the Green Lady, and is presented to Ransom, is is rough, because the temptations are, I mean, if you think back to Christ in the desert, the people are suffering, they're hungry, feed them, why not? Don't you love them? They're alone, right? So you can turn that phrase within one or two sentences. Lewis plays that out, that type of literally damning question, into the whole book. So if you want to imagine, if you haven't already, what it could have been like, the real back to Methuselah, the real back to the Garden of Eden, it's not Shaw, it's Paralandra. Explore that. For those of you that have had any experience reading John Paul II's Theology of the Body works, either his weekly audiences he gave back in the 1980s or the more consolidated works, you may recall that he talks a lot about Adam and Eve as archetypical beings, but also as real human beings, and what their personhood, even Adam's initial loneliness, entailed, and what was at stake. If I can go back, look at them, and look at Paralandra. If you haven't read any of it, I recommend you do, because I think that they are nice complements to each other: a science fiction account, and then also a theological account. I'm not going to tell you what happens in Paralandra, but I'm going to jump quickly to that hideous strength. That hideous strength takes place here on Earth. This is the silent planet, which had been cut off from all communication because the Oyarsa of Mars gathered up all of the troops from the other planets to beat back the devil, the bent Oyarsa, the corrupted Oyarsa, the fallen angel, and imprison him here on Earth. So we're stuck with it. We're the only sentient race, our fallenness. Now Ransom is back on Earth. He's kind of hidden away. His Achilles heel was gnashed at pretty bad in the previous story, and it hurts. It'd be like putting wounds in someone who may have been, putting your fingers in the wounds of someone who may have been crucified, perhaps. That type of imagery of a transfigured body we encountered Ransom. But Ransom is really not the main character of that hideous strength. That hideous strength, the title comes from an older poem about the Tower of Babel. And that hideous strength, the strength is in the older English word of a fortress, castle, tower, is that you're building this tower up to the heavens. For what? It's going to come crashing down upon us. And Lewis saw in his own lifetime, right? A ship that would never sink. Sink. Okay? Sink. Okay? A war to end all wars, which he was a part of. Lead to another war even worse. Okay? So these ambitions, peace in our day, these towers of Babel that we create, these idols of our mind, that's the setting of the third book. And the third book, in many ways, is a fictionalized presentation of the abolition of man, which he had wrote, a very important and powerful critique of trends he saw going on in the universities, not even that, in the grammar schools, the elementary schools, on how language was being played with, on how words were being corrupted, on how thought was being reduced. You go back to Orwell in 1984, Newspeak, right, where the beautiful variety of our language is reduced to just ungood, double plus ungood. You could tweet that in 146 characters. That's all it fits. Abolition of Man, Lewis, which is more of an academic work than fictional. Abolition of Man, Lewis, which is more of an academic work than fictional, gets fictionalized somewhat, and the themes there are teased out into that hideous strength. The main characters of that hideous strength are a college professor, yet again, by the name of Mark Studdock, and his wife, Jane. And she's a little frustrated that he's spending a lot more time playing politics in the office at the school he works at. He keeps getting drawn into an inner ring, which is another theme of Lewis's, where you want to be on the in crowd, be with the cool kids. Lewis has always seen that as diabolical. You'll encounter that throughout a number of his writings. The inner ring is a type of hell But for the outsiders and the uninitiated, they may not know that. They think it's attractive. It's an idol which draws you in. Is a group of scientists, university leaders, politicians, and businessmen, that original businessman we first encountered in that first book, Richard Devine, Dick Devine, as he's called. He's now a politician making a lot of money down in London. He's got influence, and he's able to play the game well, so that a very small school out on the edge of England called Edgetown, and that university, their system, you have like a law school or a pharmacy school, right? So they have different colleges. The college called Bracton College has been chosen because they have a very interesting garden outside. And for some reason, these dark forces, that inner ring, want it, and they are still in touch with this guy Devine, and they get him to use his political and business influence to play games to get the college to hand over that garden. Bragdon Wood. They set up a scientific institute called the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments, NICE. And here we see those playing with language again, the NICE. And they got all the grant money, and if they'll publish you in the right places, and you'll get tenure, and blah, blah, blah. And NICE has its designs to take over the college, take over the garden, tear down most of it, and get at the center of it, because for some reason there's something buried there that's not dead. And they want it. And the thing that's buried there that's not dead is Merlin, the wizard. And these dark forces are aware of that. Because Merlin never died. Merlin comes from a different time, a different and academic forces at their disposal, because they have plans. If Merlin wouldn't die, maybe they themselves wouldn't die. Because these are forces in their human form. Some of these mad scientists, like Mr. Wither, Mr. Frost, right? You gotta love these names, who want to live forever. And they've heard reports from their old colleague, Weston, that it might be possible to live forever, perhaps on other planets, but Merlin's living forever right here. He just has to be dug up. As the story unfolds, we encounter very local themes. Not local as so far here in your own life, but local as in not intergalactic. Much of the book, it's the length of the previous two books combined, takes place in a very small geographic area in England. But just a handful of people in a small town that gets overrun by a centralizing bureaucratic governmental force. And I say all that because, going back to something I mentioned at the very beginning, Lewis had a very local vision. All of these stories take place at arm's length. When he first leaves Malacandra and he looks out and he realizes that he was in a trench, in a canal, engineered by those sentient beings, he thought the whole planet, he traversed the whole planet. No, he was in a small area. On Earth, the conflicts that ensue are amongst the neighbors. And it reminds me of something, I guess Lewis had said it, Chesterton had said it. We were told to love your enemy, and we're told to love your neighbor. Oftentimes because they may very well be the same person. I have great neighbors, by the way, I'll say that personally. But when it comes to this story, we see day-to-day drudgery. Basically buying groceries, that type of stuff. In many ways, this story is the most real to us because it deals with events in our own life. And in some ways, it's the most out of place compared to the other two because they take place on these far-off, mystical, fantastic worlds. And yet the events that will transpire in that hideous strength, the mere mention of Merlin, the magician, what does that have to do with 1945 writing? What does that have to do with even Christian themes? And one of the things that Lewis is trying to do in that story, as I mentioned, he's fictionalizing the themes of abolition of man. He's trying to bring to conclusion, as I'm going to bring very shortly, he's trying to bring to conclusion the Space Trilogy. He's also trying to play out in day-to-day human life what it would be like for the rest of us to contend with forces, principalities, thrones and dominions that may not be in our favor. We get by with a little help from our friends, because we're not alone in this story. Arthur C. Clarke wrote a nice review of That Hideous Strength. He said compared to a lot of the books being published then, it's worthwhile, which is pretty good, I guess, for achieves Lewis's and Tolkien's initial hope to write better in that genre. He says, but the scale's kind of tipped from the beginning. You know that it's God versus the devil, so you kind of know how that's going to plan it out. Okay. I think that Lewis does a great job in making it for a town next door. And what about the town next door? So it is a story that keeps going on and on. You bring up Merlin, you say, well, he's not really Christian. Well, saying that there's a spirit that governs Mars is not really Christian either, right? It makes good fiction. When we talk about science fiction, you think of science and science fiction today, we think of probably Star Trek, which is very technological. You think about Star Wars, swashbuckling, adventurous, without a doubt. But a lot of that science is still based upon, Star Trek more than Star Wars, based upon a quantifiable, scientistic, right, to use that ideology of science point of view. Whereas Star Wars is more of a mythological component to it, right? And no surprise, Joseph Campbell, who wrote a lot about mythology, influenced Lucas in his imagination when he created Star Wars. Campbell was influenced by Carl Jung, and I am aware of at least one reference of Lewis to Jung. So Lewis was aware of Jung as well. And he mentions the idea of Jungian archetype, not to dismiss it as a paradigm, as a tool to approach day-to-day life, but just he's aware of those things in one of his books, The Discarded Image. Science, though, is more than just quantifiable data. You can go home right now. You can do it right here if you want. There's a lot of books around. You can memorize every name in the phone book and their phone number. They still make phone books? And what good would that be? That's science, that's data? No. Science and data, not even data, science in the more robust sense, in the ancient sense, in the real sense, means wisdom. Look at Aristotle. He was a philosopher. He understood more robust sense, in the ancient sense, in the real sense, means wisdom. Look at Aristotle. He was a philosopher. He understood philosophy to be the love of wisdom. That's what the word translates into. And wisdom was science. Science was wisdom. And what not was, but is, still is. We just have lost our way with that. Lewis was aware of that. He was aware of that. Bernardus Silvestris was aware of that. And Lewis draws from him and a number of other people from the Middle Ages. So the science in the science fiction, I think we need to look, in these stories, I think we need to look at not just technological, we can make coffee out of thin air, like on the Starship Enterprise, but the science of wisdom. And the fictionalized component of it is, That Hideous Strength is a fictionalized retelling of a very important work, The Abolition of Man. It is a science fiction. And this brings us back to Santa Claus. Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. Have you read that lately? Hopefully you did around the holidays, right? If not, go back and read it. The mythologies in our own world, in our own life, may be more real, may be real on other planets and other worlds. They are real here as well. And guys like Campbell, perhaps, and Jordan Peterson today talks about mythology. because they're both drawn from Carl Jung, talked about mythology. For Lewis, in his book, An Experiment in Criticism, very academic book, very, very academic book, defines what myth is to him. And myth is more than just words. Myth is more like the meaning you get from an encounter, not just of the words of a story. And we do, through our images. But myth is not false, per se. A lot of ancient myths may still offend us. Plato is aware of that in his Republic. He wanted to clean some of that up. But the best of the myths, to use a true Darwinian survival of the fittest, the true nature and aim and purpose of something, the true myths are real, here and on other planets. There are scientific ideologues amongst us today, perhaps not as nefarious and vicious as Weston, but there are some people out there who are very quick, and they're very public, and they're very quick to dismiss mythology as having any purpose. And so I think that now is a good time to go back and read or reread the Space Trilogy, because you'll encounter from some very polite purpose. And so I think that now is a good time to go back and read or reread the Space Trilogy, because you'll encounter from some very polite, smooth-talking, warm-sounding public intellectuals today some of the very same arguments that Lewis is combating through his characters in the Space Trilogy. They're on YouTube. They're in podcasts. They're in the bestseller section of some of your favorite bookstores, if they're still open. But by rereading the Space Trilogy, you'll get an imaginative take on how to perhaps recognize those false tales.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT.